Chapter 13. Prakṛti-Puruṣa Viveka Yoga, the Yoga of Differentiation. Verse 1. Arjuna said, O Keshava, I wish to know about material nature, Prakriti, the enjoyer, Purusha, the field, the knower of the field, knowledge, and the object of knowledge. Verse 2. Bhagavan Sri Kṛṣṇa replied, O son of Kunti, this body is known as the field, and one who knows this field is said by the wise to be the knower of the field. Verse 3. You should know that I am the knower of all fields, O descendant of Bharat. I consider the knowledge of the field and its knower to be real knowledge. Anuvrtti. The basis of knowledge, namely the ability to differentiate between matter, consciousness, and superconsciousness, will further be explained in this chapter. In the last few centuries, Western scientific understanding suggests that consciousness arises out of an inexplicable combination of material elements. In other words, they conclude that the body is the self. Bhagavad-gītā, however, considers such an understanding to be ignorance. Without understanding the difference between material nature, prakriti, and the self, kshetrajña, who is the conscious knower of the body, there is no basis of real knowledge. Both are distinct from one another, and one who understands this is truly learned. The material body, composed of the three subtle elements, mind, intelligence, and false ego, and the five gross elements, earth, water, fire, air, and space, is known as the field. The indwelling consciousness is known as the knower of the field, and the superconsciousness situated within all bodies and within the individual consciousness is the knower of all fields of activity. This is the subject of this chapter, upon knowing which one becomes liberated from material bondage. Verse 4. Now hear from me in brief about what that field is, what constitutes it, what are its transformations, its origin, and who is the knower of the field, and what is his influence. Verse 5. This knowledge has been sung of in many different ways by different sages, by the Vedas, and is found in the logically conclusive chapters of the Vedanta Sutras. Verses 6 and 7. The main elements are the false ego, intelligence, the unmanifest material nature, the 10 senses, the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, hate, pleasure, pain, the gross body, consciousness, and determination. All these elements that are described here are considered to be the field. Verses 8 through 12. Desirelessness, humility, non-violence, tolerance, simplicity, service to the spiritual master, purity, steadiness, self-control, detachment from sense gratification, absence of false ego, perception of the miseries of birth, death, old age, and disease, detachment, freedom from attachment to wife, children, and household life, perpetual equanimity in both happiness and distressful circumstances, constant and firm devotion unto me, dwelling in a solitary place, free from the desire to socialize with the masses, constant determination in achieving self-realization, and a desire to gain knowledge of the absolute truth. All these qualities have been declared to be knowledge. Anything contrary to this is ignorance. Anuvrtti. Here, the greater wealth of knowledge by which a human being can achieve the perfection of life has been described. This detailed explanation by Sri Kṛṣṇa leads one to an understanding that promotes self-realization and frees one from ignorance. Unfortunately, this knowledge is completely lacking in modern societies, both Eastern and Western. All contemporary fields of knowledge, i.e. biology, physics, mathematics, and philosophy, lead one to accept the body as the self and to accept gratification of one's mind, intelligence, ego, and senses as the goal of life. Such an understanding is utterly devoid of the real purpose of life, considering that this one life is the all in all and that after death there is nothing. The material world is a place of birth, death, old age, and disease, and is sometimes referred to as Mrityu-loka, or the planet of death. Birth, death, old age, and disease are indeed the real problems facing all living beings, regardless of race, nationality, or belief. Any knowledge that does not aim to put an end to these miseries is certainly incomplete at best. There are, of course, medicines, drugs, surgery, and medical machines to ease the pain of birth, slow the old age process, cure some diseases, and prolong the process of dying. But these are only stopgaps or temporary solutions. One should recognize these problems of life and be inquisitive as to where the real solution is to be found. Contrary to modern scientific and philosophical understanding, the Bhagavad-gītā says that this one life is not the all-in-all, and that there is life after death. There was life before coming to this material world, and that life continues eternally. All that really changes is the type of body one has. For the pious, there is future life in higher planets, enjoying celestial pleasures. For the ignorant, there are future sojourns within the bodies of lower species, such as animals or plants. And for the yogi, and for those who cultivate knowledge of consciousness and superconsciousness, there is future existence beyond the material universes in the Vaikuntha planets. There, life is eternal, and all bodies are of the substance known as Satchit Ananda, eternity, knowledge, and bliss. Verse 13. I shall now explain the object of knowledge, knowing which one attains immortality. It is subordinate to me, and is the eternal supreme Brahman that is beyond material cause and effect. Verse 14. His hands and feet are everywhere. His eyes, heads, and mouths are everywhere. His ears are everywhere. Thus he exists, pervading all things. Verse 15. He illuminates all the senses and their functions. However, he is devoid of any material senses himself. He remains detached, and he is the maintainer of all. Although he is devoid of all material qualities, he is the master of all qualities. Verse 16. He is situated in all moving and non-moving beings. He is near, yet simultaneously he is far away. Thus, he is most subtle and difficult to fully understand. Verse 17. Although it seems that he is divided amongst all living beings, he is in fact undivided. He is to be known as the Creator, Maintainer, and Destroyer. Verse 18. He is said to be the most brilliant of all luminaries, beyond darkness. He is knowledge, the object of knowledge, and the aim of all knowledge. Verse 19. Thus the field of activities, knowledge, and the object of knowledge have been briefly explained. By understanding these, my devotee attains love for me. Anuvrtti. As previously mentioned, the Absolute Truth is known in three phases of realization: Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. The He of whom Kṛṣṇa speaks of in these verses as being subordinate to him, yet being the Supreme Brahman, refers to the Paramatma. His hands, feet, eyes, and ears are everywhere, and he is situated in the hearts of all living beings. He is all-pervasive throughout the universe. He divides himself to be within all things, yet he himself is not divided or diminished. He remains the complete person. This is stated in the invocation of the Ishopanishad as follows. Om Purnamada Purnamidham Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadhaya Purnamevavashishyate. Translation. The Supreme Person is perfect and complete, and because he is completely perfect, all emanations from him, such as this material world, are also perfect and complete. Whatever emanates from the complete person is also complete in itself. Because he is the complete person, even though so many complete units emanate from him, he remains the complete balance. It would seem that the discourse between the theist and the atheist is perpetually in gridlock. But as mentioned in a previous Anuvrtti, the student of Bhagavad-gītā does not consider either the so-called theist or the atheist to have complete knowledge. It may even be that sometimes the atheist is more correct in his opinion than the so-called theist. The theist establishes his God, and the atheist, upon examining the statements of the so-called theist, discovers that the God in question is wrathful, vindictive, jealous, vengeful, sadomasochistic, etc. In this instance, we would have to agree with the atheist. There is no such God. However, the atheist then concludes that in the absence of God, the universe and all life within it has come from nothing. Yet he has no experience or proof that something can arise from nothing. His proposal is thus self-defeating. Both God and his non-existence are but misconceptions in the minds of the so-called theist and the atheist. However, the student of Bhagavad-gītā knows that the subject matter is not a thesis about God. Bhagavad-gītā is a discourse aimed at enlightenment in the absolute truth. The absolute truth contains all things known, knowable, and unknown, before the universe, within the universe, after the universe, and beyond the universe. Verse 20. You should know that both material nature and the living beings are without beginning. Try to understand that all transformations and the modes of nature originate from material nature. Verse 21. It is said that material nature is the source of all causes and effects. The living beings are said to be the cause of their own happiness and distress. Verse 22. Situated within material nature, the living beings enjoy the modes that are born of material nature. Due to the individual's association with these modes, the living beings take birth repeatedly within higher and lower species of life. Verse 23. The Supreme Person, who is known as the Superconsciousness, Param-Atma, resides within this body. He is the witness of all things, the supreme authority, the provider, the maintainer, and the ultimate controller. Verse 24. Therefore, one who fully understands the Supreme Person, material nature, and the modes of material nature, never takes birth again under any circumstances. Verse 25. Through meditation, some yogis glimpse the Supreme within the heart. Others see him through the process of analysis, Sankhya, while others perceive him through karma yoga. Verse 26. There are also those that do not know these methods, but simply by hearing about him from others, they engage in his worship. Because they have faith in what they have heard, they too transcend death. Anuvrtti. It is described that both material nature, Prakriti, and the living beings, Jivatma or Purusha, are without beginning, Anadi. This means that material nature and the living beings exist as eternal energies of Sri Krsna before the process of creation takes place. The living being's origin is in the Tatashta, or marginal plane, before the onslaught of time. In this regard, the origin of the living beings and material nature are both anadi, or having no first cause. They are without a first cause because they are shaktis, or potencies of the Absolute Truth, who is himself without origin. In other words, the cause of all causes is Sri Krsna. Thus he is known as Sarva Karana Karanam. Though material nature and the living beings are eternal and without beginning, they nonetheless have distinctly different qualities and characteristics. They are not the same. Material nature is described as the body, senses, and other elements, as well as the transformations of qualities such as happiness, distress, lamentation, and illusion. The living beings are part and parcel of the Supreme Person. They are Sat-Chit Ananda, having the constitution of eternity, knowledge, and bliss. When the living beings identify the self as the material body, they suffer under the miseries of happiness and distress and perpetually transmigrate from one body to the next in the cycle of birth and death. One of the greatest questions in life, namely, where do we come from, is certainly answered in Bhagavad-gītā. Yet the use of the word anadi in verse 20 has encouraged some thinkers to conclude that the living beings have always been in the material world. In other words, that although the living beings are eternal, they begin in the material universe and have always been in the material universe. This conclusion, however, is not supported by previous acharyas of the Bhagavad-gītā, such as Vishwanath Chakravarti, Baladev Vidyabhushan, and others. To them, anadi means beginningless, before time began. Regarding the origin of the living beings and their beginning as anadi, the Vaishnavacharya Swami B.G Maharaj says as follows: Since time immemorial, man has inquired about the origin of the living being. Who am I? Where have I come from? How does the living being first appear in this world? From what stage of spiritual existence does he fall into the material world? There are two classes of living beings who come into this world. One class comes from the spiritual Vaikuntha planets by the necessity of Nitya Lila, the eternal pastimes of Kṛṣṇa. Another comes by constitutional necessity. The Brahmajyoti, the non-differentiated marginal plane, is the source of infinite living beings, jivatmas, atomic spiritual particles of non-differentiated character. The rays of the transcendental body of the Supreme Person are known as Brahmajyoti, and a ray of the Brahmajyoti is the jivatma. The jivatma is an atom in that effulgence, and the Brahmajyoti is a product of an infinite number of jivatma atoms. Generally, jivatmas emanate from the Brahmajyoti, which is living and growing. Within the Brahmajyoti, their equilibrium is somehow disturbed, and movement begins. From non-differentiation, differentiation begins. From a plain sheet of uniform consciousness, individual conscious units grow, and because the jivatma is conscious, it is endowed with free will. From the marginal position, Tatashta Shakti, they choose either the side of exploitation, material world, or the side of dedication, Vaikuntha. Kṛṣṇa bhuli se jiva anadi bahirmukha. Anadi means that which has no beginning. When we enter the land of exploitation, we come within the factor of time, space, and thought. And when we come to exploit, action and reaction begins in the negative land of lone. When the jivatma, by exercise of his free will and out of curiosity, first enters into this land, from then he becomes a factor of this limited world. But his participation is beyond the beginning of this limited world. That is why it is said to be anadi. Anadi means that it does not come from within the jurisdiction of this limited world. Once subject to contact with material nature, the living beings are then subject to karma, the laws of action and reaction. Under these laws, the living beings enjoy and suffer in various species of life. During their material sojourn, the Paramatma accompanies the living beings and is ever watchful for when they will turn their heads towards the absolute truth. The Paramatma directs the wanderings of the living beings, and when one desires to know the truth, the Paramatma manifests before the living beings as the spiritual master who teaches Bhagavad-gītā as it is. Hence the living being transcends the world of birth and death. Brahmanda Brahmite Kona Bhagyavana Jiva Guru Kṛṣṇa Prasadhe Pai Bhakti Lata Bija. Translation: According to their karma, the jivatmas are wandering throughout the universe. Some jivatmas, who are most fortunate, receive the mercy of Guru and Kṛṣṇa, and by such mercy they receive the seed of the creeper of devotion. From the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila. Verse 27. You should understand that whatever exists, whether moving or non-moving, is simply manifest from the combination of the field and the knower of the field, O best of the Bharat dynasty. Verse 28. One actually sees when he perceives the Supreme Controller as being situated in all living beings, and realizes that neither the superconsciousness nor the individual unit of consciousness is perishable. Verse 29. By seeing the Supreme Person situated in all places equally, one does not become degraded. Thus he attains the supreme abode. Verse 30. One who realizes that all activities are performed by material nature understands that he is not the doer. Verse 31. When one truly sees, he ceases to identify the body as the self. Realizing that all living beings are equal, he attains the Brahman conception and sees them expanded everywhere. Anuvrtti. The world is composed of moving and non-moving things. Moving species consist of humans, animals, fish, etc. Non-moving objects include trees, mountains, minerals, etc. Sri Kṛṣṇa says that all these moving and non-moving things are a combination of material nature and the living beings. One who has deeper vision sees that the superconsciousness is the controller of all things and is situated in the hearts of all living beings, within every atom and in between every atom. Such a seer is a true knower and realizes that consciousness and superconsciousness are both eternal and imperishable. A seer of the truth is never degraded by the influences of material nature. He gradually rises to perfection and attains the supreme abode of Kṛṣṇa. Those who are conditioned by material nature and who have no knowledge of superconsciousness wrongly conceive that they are the doer of activities, or that they are the overlords of material nature. This, however, is a foolish idea, since they themselves are helplessly suffering at the hands of death. For those who have the eyes to see, all forms of life indicate the presence of a conscious living being. That is to say, that not just humans are conscious, or that only human consciousness is eternal. All things that manifest birth, growth, maintenance, reproduction, dwindling, and death, regardless of higher birth, human, or lower birth, animal, are known as eternal beings transmigrating in the material world. Thus one who is friendly, kind, and compassionate must be so to all forms of life. It is not that humans are spared, but animals and others can be killed or exploited for our pleasure. This idea falls short of the vision of Bhagavad-gītā, which sees all living beings as part and parcel of the Supreme Person, Kṛṣṇa. Thus, all living beings have a right to life. Verse 32. O son of Kunti, the superconsciousness has no beginning. He is transcendental to the modes of nature, and he is unlimited. Although he is situated within each individual body, he neither acts nor is he affected by any action. Verse 33. Just as the subtle element of all-pervading space does not mix with anything, similarly, the individual unit of consciousness does not mix with the material body, although it is situated within. Verse 34. O Bharat, just as one sun illuminates the entire universe, the occupier of the field illuminates the whole field. Verse 35. One who knows and sees the difference between the body and the self, and who understands the process of liberation from material bondage, also attains the supreme goal. Anuvrtti. The Paramatma enters the material nature and makes all things possible within that nature, but he himself is never contaminated. He is never an illusion, never under the influence of time, never subject to death or the reactions to work and the laws of material nature. Superconsciousness is always the master of material nature, and material nature is always subservient. Although the living beings are situated within the material body, they do not actually mix or become one with it. The living beings are always distinct from the material body, even when the living beings are conditioned by it. One who knows this in relation to Sri Kṛṣṇa attains the supreme goal of life. Om Tat Sat. Thus ends Chapter 13, entitled Prakṛti-Puruṣa Viveka Yoga, from the conversation between Sri Kṛṣṇa and Arjuna in the Upanishad known as Srimad Bhagavad-gītā, the Yoga Shastra of divine knowledge, from the Bhishma Parva of Mahabharata, the literature revealed by Vyas in 100,000 verses.